Hi everyone, welcome back to the 2 Degree C Climate Chat. Joining me today, co-founder of 2 Degree C, Jenny Disson, and our guests today, Katie Kearns and Dr. Ed Kearns, joining us to talk about the intersection of data, technology, investment, and environmental justice in environmental solutions. So join us as we explore in the 2 Degree C Climate Chat. Okay, Jenny, before we bring Dr. Kearns in, I'd like to maybe have you frame the discussion about how climate observation data affects the decision-making process, the data to decision process.
Sure, thanks, Neil. It's a good start to the dialogue. So we've talked before about how scientists study our entire Earth, planet, space, ocean, atmosphere, and the different spheres of the Earth are studied by putting instruments and observing networks to understand data at different locations. These data that are collected can be collected from different sources. It could be satellites, buoys, stations, balloons. Those interested could further look into NOAA and also look at their data center, the National Centers for Environmental Information. So scientists all over the world monitor the Earth, and they study the ocean, land, and atmosphere, and the sun. And the monitoring of the variables that define our Earth are collected. The data is collected from these spheres and analyzed. They're assessed for historical understanding and for future projections and predictions. When the data is assessed and analyzed, it is used as input into either equations or algorithms or issues and topics that planners, decision makers across all sectors of the economy are challenged with. So when you think about the data fitting into the context of the decision, it is really about what is the question that is being asked? What is the risk that is being faced? What is being planned for? Is it a bridge? Is it energy? Is it renewable energy? Are we talking about ecosystem? Is it development of infrastructure? Is it insurance products, reinsurance, catastrophe models? Depending on the issue, the challenge, the opportunity, the product or the service or the program, all those different aspects have a decision context to them. And I think environmental information arguably underpins most, if not all, aspects of the different sectors of our economy. All of these sectors intersect with our Earth system one way or another. They affect the resources, they affect our spheres, which in turn affects human health. So you can start to note how environmental data is the beginning or the underpinning component of, if you ask me, all aspects of our life on planet Earth.
Our guests today are Katie Kearns and Dr. Ed Kearns. So welcome to both of you. Katie, you just graduated as in applied mathematics and creative technologies. And Dr. Kearns, you are the Chief Data Officer for the First Street Foundation. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So let's start here. You're welcome. Let's have both of you introduce yourselves and just explain to the listeners your backgrounds and your bios. Who would like to go first?
I can go first. So hi, I'm Katie Kearns. I am a very recent graduate from Berry College. And like Neil said, I graduated with a degree in mathematics and creative technologies. So kind of my interest in kind of where I'm going, I'm interested in a lot of hardware technologies and problem solving. That's kind of my creative technologies is a very unique degree. It gave me an education in kind of a combination of engineering, industrial design, human-centered design, and computer science. So I'm very involved in, or I took an interest in hardware technology specifically. So that's kind of where I'm headed.
That's great. And this is a kind of a unique experience because this is a father-daughter interview. And Ed, you have a pretty unique background too. Why don't you tell us about that?
Happy to. So first off, the most important thing is I'm Katie's father, along with two other kids that we have too, Daniel and Megan. I got my start at University of Miami. I grew up in Miami, but I went to undergraduate there and also had a dual major like Katie did, and mine was in physics and marine science. And then I went on to pursue a PhD in physical oceanography at the University of Rhode Island, and was doing what we call blue water oceanography, open ocean type work. But then when Katie and her siblings started showing up, my wife was asking, "Hey, are you going to keep going out on those ships for 60, 90 days at a time?" And I said, "No, of course not." So I started to do some nearshore work. So I started working at the National Data Buoy Center, which is in part of NOAA in Mississippi. Worked there for about 2 years, and then returned to the University of Miami as a postdoc and eventually a professor, where I pursued satellite oceanography. So again, that was something I could actually do from my desk. Didn't have to go out to sea that often. The satellites collect the data, and the observations that Jenny was talking about, and, send them to the computers there, and we can do our climate work. And so that's where I really started to get into climate science and the construction of well-calibrated observations from space. That's one of the tricks to understanding climate change on Earth, is to tease out all the instrument artifacts from your measurement, so you can be sure when you're looking at the data that you're seeing what's really happening on Earth and not what's happening to your observing system. And so I worked there for about 10 years or so, and then actually started working for the National Park Service on Everglades restoration, which is very much an applied science project. But then returned to NOAA back up in Asheville. It was what then called the National Climatic Data Center, which is now called the National Centers for Environmental Information, to expound on that work on the climate data records from satellites. So to try to assemble what I've been doing at the University of Miami under contract to NASA, to do that for NOAA operationally, of have many of these global long-term records of Earth observations that scientists could use for driving climate models and taking other assessments of Earth's changing climate. And so I worked at what is essentially NOAA's archive for, again, about 12 years. Near the end of my time with NOAA, for the last 3 or 4 years, I was the chief data officer of the entire organization. That was a very rewarding experience to work across NOAA, including fisheries and weather service and other parts of NOAA. They're doing great climate work. And in my last year with federal government, I actually reestablished the role of the chief data officer at the department level, the Department of Commerce. So again, and working a lot with the White House to get all that squared away. That was, again, very rewarding. But about a year ago, I left to join this nonprofit, Neil, that you mentioned during the introduction, the First Street Foundation, which has a very unique mission of quantifying, communicating climate change at the individual level. So I feel like, my career's kind of come back to its roots of why I got my interest in environmental science in the first place.
Full circle. I love it. That's great. So I'm glad you started in the ocean, because I do have an ocean question for you. You've spent a lot of time on ships and things like that, like you said before. And so you spent a long period of your career working with ocean sensing equipment. And, the question that I have about that is, can you perhaps relate your experience working with those sensors and what kind of barriers you encountered? And, the broader question is, do we have enough ocean data?
Yeah, I think the feeling in the ocean community is we can never have enough ocean data. And there is some truth to that, because the ocean is difficult to sample, unlike the atmosphere, which we can use things like radar to sample the atmosphere. The ocean is mainly, opaque to electromagnetic radiation, so we can't use a lot of those same techniques we use in the atmosphere or from satellite to look under the ocean. It's very, very difficult.
Right.
So the more measurements we can accumulate, the better off we are to understand what's actually happening in the ocean.
And how does that apply to the near-shore environment, the coral reef environment? Is there a lack of high-resolution data in that particular area that services such a high biomass?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of high resolution measurements on our coral reefs and along our shorelines. With the advent of LiDAR technologies, now we have more information about the bathymetry in these areas, which is a great help. But in terms of temperature, nutrients, all these other important things that are putting stresses on coral reefs that are big determinants in how the local ecosystems are working. A lot of times we have to work with proxy data. So, for example, ocean color, that's something else we can measure from satellite, which gives us an indication of how much phytoplankton is growing in the water, how much dissolved organic material might be in the water. But again, these are sometimes very difficult measurements to make at the kind of resolution that we need for some of these coastal processes.
Right.
You said resolution. Can you define for us what you mean by resolution?
Yes. So if you're dealing with a coral reef, you're probably looking at like the length scale that matters. Sort of like if you imagine like a picture of a coral reef, it'd be like the pixel size of a coral reef in that image. So what's important in a coral reef? You're probably talking about meter resolution, meter by meter, or 5 meter by 5 meter block over a coral reef, where that's how the reef is varying and how the life is changing across the reef as you kind of take a transect across it. From satellite, trying to get measurements of things like ocean color at those kind of measurements, or those kind of horizontal resolutions, very, very difficult. A lot of the new commercial satellite imagery that's available for commercial purchase, the kind of stuff that you see on Google Maps and such, those don't necessarily have the right bands, the right optical bands in that to do the kind of measurements that scientists want to make over the coral reef. So the typical visible wavelength RGB kind of values that you see only tell you so much. So there's a challenge both in the horizontal resolution and the spectral resolution from the measurements to try to, if we're using satellites or drones or aircraft to sample our coral reefs, it becomes quite a challenge.
Described barefoot luxury, the casually sophisticated Southern Cross Club is Little Cayman's original resort. This hidden gem is as unique and vibrant as the island it inhabits. A true island treasure, it is the perfect place to dive, fish, and relax. Its 14 beachfront bungalows are situated on 900 feet of white sand, only minutes from the world-class diving found only in Little Cayman. Visit www.southerncrossclub.com to book your escape to tranquility.
Hey, this is Megan Haney-Greer, freediver, ocean explorer, and marine educator. Also, the imperfect conservationist. You're listening to the 2 Degrees C Climate Chat podcast.
So here we have this vast ocean. We don't have enough data. We have various technology and modes like satellites that you have a lot of experience with. And we have the variables to that we're looking for to better understand our oceans. Sea surface temperature being one of them, color, salinity, light, pH, pressure, all at a specific depth in the ocean. So as you think about sea surface temperature as an example, this SST data is pretty accurate over ocean data, over the open ocean data. But what happens as we get near shore? What are the issues and what do you think could be improved?
And SST, just to be clear for this, is sea surface temperature, right?
Yep, sea surface.
Yeah, so one of the curious things, like you said, Jenny, out in the open ocean, away from land, our measurements of sea surface temperature are actually pretty good. A lot of work, decades of work has gone into that. As you get closer to the shore, you start to get some interference from land effects that are also making their way, if we're doing it from satellite, making their way up to the satellite for its measurements. But curiously, the changes in temperature are much greater in the near shore. So we can live with that reduced resolution, in some way that reduced accuracy, because the processes that are at work near shore can vary by several degrees, can make a huge difference in how the nearshore physics is working or how the nearshore ecology is responding. Out in the open ocean, it's a kind of a different challenge. So that's a good thing. that we can make do with lower resolution or lower accuracy measurements. We don't have to go through quite as great pains. However, back to the point about the horizontal resolution, the processes at work there near shore are much smaller resolution. So out in the open ocean, we can get away with, a kilometer resolution or more, and we could still understand what's going on out there. Near shore, we definitely need things down like, at the 100-meter resolution, 10-meter resolution, it would be far superior to actually understand what's going on at the shoreline. So it's a trade-off on the challenges there.
So if such a technology were to exist for nearshore observations with the level of specificity and resolution that would be beneficial for not only ecosystem, land management, real estate, offshore wind, renewable energy, coral reefs, would you see interest in that type of observation? And do you see I'm coming to you next, Katie, because that was a technology question.
Yeah. So to break the resolution question into maybe two different pieces. One is like sort of from the science side. What is the scale that we need to measure the Earth, measure the oceans, to be able to understand the processes at work there, so we can understand how climate is changing, we understand how the ecosystems are changing, how they're working. That's one question. The other question is, it gets a little bit more personal because it's about how the people are interacting with the data, with the environment, right? So that's a whole different scale. So for the physics, getting away with the 10-meter resolution to understand the physical process is great, and scientists are used to dealing with those kinds of those limitations. But at what point does the data become at such a level, not just resolution, but at a meaningful level that the individual can grasp it and understand it, and it's meaningful to them in their life? And that's one of the great challenges facing us in climate science. We can describe how climate is changing around the world, but what it means to that individual standing on the beach or swimming in the ocean is something entirely different.
So, Katie, you grew up understanding environmental issues, opportunities, technology, satellites, probably since you were just crawling. And you studied creative technologies as part of your academic training. So what do you hope to achieve with this training? And what would you like to see happen as it relates to environmental issues?
Yeah. So I have always had an interest in problem solving, and obviously climate change is a huge issue. Growing up with my father being very involved in that area, I saw a lot of the issues from a young age. So studying technology was kind of my way of kind of bringing that knowledge from my father to kind of different aspects of career areas. So one of my goals is, because of my education in technology, I'm looking to build and solve problems, and the problems might not necessarily be climate change itself, but while I'm solving those problems, keeping climate change in mind and keeping those issues in mind. So if I'm making a product, I'm building it with sustainable resources and keeping all of those things in mind as I'm going through with my career.
Yeah. So it might help you design a technology solution appropriately as that technology interacts with the humans.
Yeah, no, I think having the older generation taking this data and making it, having a large amount of data and making it accessible for generations like mine to use that data with the tools that we have, with the technology that we have, and making sense of it and really doing something about it. I think people like my father, who didn't really get a giant chance to kind of make a change because it kind of happened as they were growing up. So now my dad is taking the data and trying to make it accessible for everybody to see, so that we can do something about it, and have the information and the backing for it.
You said data, and you said technology that is available, but I would say technology that you will create based on that data.
So Katie, let's talk a little bit about addressing the intergenerational inequity and the role of, using new technologies and applying these to, climate action. So where do you feel the importance lies in being able to, for the next generation to be able to push that message forward and to drive that ball forward?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of opportunity for new technologies, especially like the older generations taking all of this data. There's an opportunity to take more data, but also create technologies to use the data to solve problems. So I think it's important for our generation to really push forward with the knowledge that we know and the information that we've learned, and try to really be better and to improve.
And that would mean, designing and developing new tools as well, correct?
Yeah. New tools to take data, new tools to improve the way that we use energy, things like that.
With so many wonderful destinations around the world to choose from, a little help can go a long way. Quest Dive Adventures is your premium adventure travel company, offering a wide and diverse selection of destinations to choose from, with dive adventures from the Pacific to the Caribbean, and adventure travel from Costa Rica to Africa. Quest Dive Adventures offers packages including flights and accommodations, activities, transfers, diving, and more. Everything to enjoy your perfect vacation. What's your request?
So pivoting back to you for a second, Ed, there are many ways that we can expand upon the information source about our Earth system that would be beneficial for this next generation. And we think about, how do we make that happen? How do we expand and elaborate on the data sources? What role, if any, do you see being beneficial from citizen science? How does First Street consider citizen science information? And could that be looked at further for data collection?
Yeah, so in terms of data collection, I think it's an interesting challenge to make climate science be very personal. And so for Katie's generation, for example, as she was just describing, bringing technologies in to help measure climate change, this is an active way of getting that generation involved in climate science, right? At a very personal level. I think that's one thing that with our previous generation, so, okay, I'm old, I'm gray, in our generation, climate has always been treated as a very impersonal subject. It's like climate is something that's happening somewhere else to somebody else. It's not happening to me. I look out my window, things look just fine. I don't really notice the change around me. And in fact, so what First Street is doing now is actually kind of targeting the previous generation, right? With that kind of mindset of making climate meaningful to people. And First Street, our strategy is to start with different climate perils. We took on flood first because it's the most prevalent and expensive climate risk in the United States. But to boil all this climate science down into a property by property assessment of what's going to happen to your home. What is the risk of your home? We put a number between 1 and 10 on your home. And then now what we've also recently done is released an estimate of what it's going to cost you. What is climate going to cost you in terms of flood damage to your home over the next 30 years, right? So we're trying to make that a very impersonal subject, climate, very, very meaningful to a person, because it's like if you let them know what's going to happen to their pocketbook, let them know to their home, it can make a difference. And if you've talked with people who have gone through flooding events before, they understand in a very personal, visceral level what flood can do to their homes and their families and their livelihoods, and they take it very seriously. If you've never had a flooding event in your home, it's not personal yet, right? And so, and it's really hard to tell somebody who's lived in a home for 20 years that their flood risk is going up, and they say, well, it's never flooded here before. I'm like, well, welcome to climate change. This is what is very difficult to communicate, right? And so for the older generations, this is the strategy that First Street is taking, because we're still having to make people aware that climate risk is real. In Katie's generation, Katie's been growing up with a different reality of climate change has always been on the table, but they haven't been involved, right?
Yeah.
They haven't been personally involved. This is something that the scientists in Washington or somebody or some university, they're figuring this out. It's like, no, wait, this has got to be full court press. Everybody across our society has to participate in some way and become part of the solution. And so this, the citizen science approach of involving individuals in taking measurements that can be used for climate change, of just going out and sampling the earth and becoming part of that awareness of that the earth is changing, is very important for moving that climate needle, for actually inspiring action. Because if people don't care, they're not going to take action.
Great. I so appreciate your comments there. So as you think about flood as a peril, there's other perils that, any individual who has experienced that peril, whether it's wildfire or a catastrophe, or the inability to pay insurance and having to withstand that particular disaster, it's very painful. And earthquake, tsunami, they're all very, very difficult to deal with when they affect you and your family. So citizen science can help move the needle, and would localized data collection and the availability of localized data help improve our understanding and products and information?
Yeah, I believe so. And one of the interesting results of some of our economics research has been that like you mentioned, some of these high severity but low frequency events, right, like a tsunami or say Cat 5 hurricane or something like this, people generally don't do a very good job of wrapping their heads around that kind of probabilistic event. This is just the nature of people. But when it comes to the lower severity, higher frequency events, so imagine king tides, right? So like a lot of places like Miami Beach or Charleston or Norfolk, right, are being heavily impacted at this point right now. The economic impact in those communities is enormous right now, and it's growing. And it's literally happening like every other day. And these are things that people can get out into their environment and sample this information. They can collect data. They can take pictures. They can and some of these local communities have actually started this kind of grassroots kind of thing to understand what the effects are on their communities. And it's becoming meaningful. It's becoming meaningful because it's being reflected in how these communities are behaving. It's being reflected in things like home prices. It's being reflected in where people are moving and how they're adapting to this kind of change. And so I think every time you can bring things down to that root level, and because the high frequency events seem to be more impactful at this point, this is a good thing, because you can't go out and sample a Cat 5 hurricane every day, nor do you want to. The kids out there, Katie, yes, don't walk out in a Cat 5 hurricane. That's not what you want to do. But to go out
develop technology to do that. So
but yeah, exactly. There's great technology, great drone technology and stuff that can do that, both in the ocean and the atmosphere. Exactly. You can sit in the airplane and drop the things out into the middle of the storm, and you can be safe while you do it. Yes, and that's a fun ride. But to have citizen scientists go out there and get involved in those higher frequency, low intensity events like king tides, have them go out there, and again, it can become very visceral when you can see the street in your community totally flooded, when you see that cars can't go down there, you see fish swimming in the streets and stuff like this, right? This leaves a lasting impression on people, like, oh my gosh, something is changing. This is not normal to have fish in my street. Okay, very good. step one,
Yeah.
awareness is raised. Now, step two is inspire them to take action. And there's a whole multitude of actions that can take place. But the first thing is, like what citizen science is about, is getting involved.
And that's a good opportunity, Katie, to ask you, how you feel that, these kind of technologies can be applied in a meaningful way to try and, or do you think it will alleviate any of the next generation's climate anxiety?
So I think that creative technologies can be used to try to do something about the problem, to alleviate some anxiety. I know that I always grew up with the fish in the streets. That anxiety, that climate anxiety, has always been there, and trying to kind of combat that. For a while, I kind of tried to push it out of my brain, like most people do, like the last generation did, and I realized you can't do that. So my goal is to use technology to try to do something about this, so that my kids don't run into this climate anxiety, because that's one of the biggest issues. That's why a lot of people like to kind of shove it away, is because they're anxious about it, and not one person can do something about it. So creating a technology that gives people hope, something that they can do about it, something that they know they have like an effect, and what they can do to help, is kind of the goal.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. Hope. It does create hope.
All right. Last question as part of our closing, and we'll hand it back to you, Neil, in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
Last question. What would you like to see happen in terms of the single most important investment made by any enterprise, whether it's the government, private sector, private equity, an individual, a philanthropist? What is the one thing that you think current leaders can provide resources for? What one investment needs to be made today?
I think for current leaders, I honestly think they just need to listen. They need to listen to us. They need to be ready that we all care about it. Our generation cares about it. So as they're hiring new people like me who are just graduated, they need to be prepared that climate change is something that matters to us. And if your company is not taking that into account, or if that's not something that's on your mind, then they're not going to want to work for you. They want to work for people who care about this. So leaders just need to listen and be ready.
Ed?
Well, I think you guys have.
Well, what, Ed?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the greatest investment that can be made right now would be to build bridges between government and private industry, because this is to solve this climate issue that's facing us all. This is not something that the government alone is going to be able to do. This is not something that academia, by publishing papers, is going to just obviously this is the way forward. And this is not something that private industry left alone is going to solve either. It's definitely going to have to you have to wire these groups together in a meaningful way to take action, right? So as Katie was saying, she grew up, with fish industry. Katie grew up in South Florida, right, in Miami, which is like ground zero for climate change, right? The people in South Florida don't often appreciate that they are already, in a technology sense, they're already living in a heavily adapted area. So the engineers, back in the 1950s, started building an extensive flood control network throughout South Florida that allows the folks to live there and the homes to be dry there under most conditions. That system, as the governments of Miami-Dade and Broward and others down there, as they know, it's reaching a tipping point where those systems were not engineered for the climate of 2030. They were engineered for the climate of 1950. And but the people in those areas are not aware of those technologies that are surrounding them or how dependent they are on them, right? So they are in the middle of learning what those challenges are, what those limits are. But governments getting involved along with private industry to help come up with some of these solutions is going to be very important, because these solutions need to be equitable. The wealthier communities have the resources to deal with these kinds of things. The poorer communities or more vulnerable communities don't, but we definitely need to adapt as a society together, sort of in lockstep. And as Katie was saying, with private industry, with the younger workforce entering into private industry, they want to be engaged in such a way that's helping to contribute to the solution, not to make the problem any worse, right? And so it's definitely, like I said before, full court press. This is not something that we can think that just one segment of our society is just gonna just fix it for us all. Now, that everybody has to be involved every day through our actions to get to where we need to be. Yeah.
I think, Ed, that just sums it up so well. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts, both you and Katie. And Katie, we wish you all of the best in your success in your brand new career. And to Ed, all of the best in your new foundation, the First Street Foundation. And anybody would like to know more about that, it's firststreet.org. And also to check out your tool, which is floodfactor.com. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Floodfactor.com. Well, thank you both for coming in and joining us for the 2 Degree C Climate Chat. We hope to have you back again soon, and maybe an update about your new career, Katie. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, guys. Let's pivot out to the news, and we do like to discuss the news here, and we have a newsletter that goes out once a week called the 2 Degree C Climate Check, where we pull 2 or 3 climate news and stories or interesting news stories that are current, and add that to a scientific report that we found. And you can sign up for that at 2degreec.org, just once a week, just the facts. And joining me to discuss today's news, Dr. Carson Shine. So thanks, Carson, for coming back.
Thanks, Neil.
One of the news stories that was circulating right now, and sticking with the ocean theme, says how a digital ocean can unlock climate fighting potential. And that's an interesting topic for us. And what can you tell us is going on, and where do you think the gaps in the ocean data are?
Yeah, this is a really timely article, especially for 2 Degrees C. Because it really highlights and underscores our message that there really is not enough data on the ocean. I mean, 90% of it is still unexplored. And the few data points that we do have in the ocean, they come from a handful of buoys, ships that are traversing regular trade routes. But the rest of the ocean is largely still devoid of any observations. And really, this article and our message is that we can close these data gaps. Technology has been evolving and advancing in ways that are making these ocean sensors far more economical and robust. And a lot of folks, this article was talking a little bit about NATO having interest in deploying millions of these small buoys that would drift around the ocean, collecting observations. But again, a big problem is that a lot of the really important parts of the ocean are really inshore, where these drifters generally do not go because they drift in currents that keep them offshore. So there's really a huge data gap in the nearshore environment that, of course, 2 Degrees C is trying to close. But at the same time, across the open oceans, there is a vast need for greater observations. There's one estimate by the World Resources Institute that suggests that the oceans, understanding the oceans better, could help help cut global emissions by about 21%. That's through more sustainable fishing and shipping, transportation, but we have to understand these issues, both the atmosphere over the ocean as well as the ocean water itself, and that really just requires a vast increase in the amount of observation that's out there.
Right. So, I mean, you briefly mentioned where the observations are taking place, but let's understand that network a little better. How is that network of observations put together? There's certainly information coming from satellites, right?
Sure. Satellites are the large eye in the sky that is looking down on the planet, and the ocean makes up 72% or so of the ocean of the Earth's surface. So these satellites are invaluable in capturing information about these oceans,
Mm-hmm.
especially in places where we can't reliably or inexpensively get to. But they have a big limitation in that they can't see into the ocean. They really can only see the ocean's surface, and usually only when the skies are clear above that ocean. So they're looking at sea surface temperature, for example, and that's really a challenge if you're trying to understand what's going on within the ocean's water column, from the surface down to the seabed. So the rest of the network is really cobbled together by moored buoys that have been put in place in various parts of the ocean, for example, across the equatorial Pacific to monitor El Nino conditions, for example. There are a few buoys along coastlines, generally in areas where there is a need to understand conditions for shipping. And then there's an array of drifting buoys that are released from research ships throughout the ocean, and they do exactly what you would imagine they do. They drift in the currents. Some of them will descend to several hundred meters depth, collect observations, come back up to the surface, and send their data off. And in addition, there are numerous data collection opportunities with research projects throughout the oceans. But again, these are generally very small scale, very discrete observation campaigns, and many times those data don't become available to the public for months or even years after they're collected, as the data are analyzed and the research is being conducted. So really, there's just this ad hoc network of observations that are more or less observations of opportunity.
And if we're thinking about specifically the climate, because how we know that the ocean is important to climate, that's already been established in previous episodes, but how do we take that information and those data gaps that are being filled by these different sources or different streams of information? How is that advancing the understanding of climate?
I mean, every bit of data that is captured helps in our understanding, because these data then can go into the ocean and atmosphere, the coupled models that are trying to reconstruct the climate and project it forward. So having those additional data will help to increase the resolution and accuracy, enhancing these models. But again, in places where we have no data, we really are not increasing the level of certainty of these models at all. We can only guess that it may be improving.
And you mentioned the nearshore environment being the area that you would focus on, and why is that so important?
For a number of reasons. It's largely the breeding ground for the majority of the ocean's species, including the commercial fishing species. And these ecosystems that are in the nearshore environment, whether they're natural or artificial, like shipwrecks and such, they do provide shoreline protection from storm surges and things like that. So they're really important to a lot of coastal communities. And if they are damaged, then those communities lose that resource. So the natural infrastructure in the nearshore environment is absolutely essential to the roughly half of the world's population that lives on or near the coast.
Right. Well, I do thank you for explaining that out to us today, and we will definitely be watching this a bit closer. Thanks, Karsten.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the 2 Degrees C Climate Chat. If you have a question you would like answered, a topic for discussion, or would like to be a guest on the show, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your stories and climate journeys, and if you like what you've heard today, please like, subscribe, and comment wherever you hear your podcasts. Next week, we'll be joined by Dr. Jennifer Jackson of the Hakai Institute in Canada to discuss her work as a physical oceanographer in British Columbia. Her work focuses on how the ocean is changing and the ripple effects manifesting through this realm. So be sure to check back in then, or find out more about the stories you just heard by visiting our blog at 2degreesc.org and connect to others like you via our social media. Thank you to our sponsors and partners without which this podcast is not possible, with special thanks to Seren Media for producing today's episode. To find out more about our partners, please visit our website, and if you'd like to become a sponsor or partner, please email us at podcast@2degreesc.org.